Community and regional development. That's pretty much my whole life. It's become what state policy is all about. State economic development policy is now based on that formula, taking a regional approach, regional lens, but bringing it down as local and micro-local as you can to the community. Community revitalization, smart growth, sustainability, resiliency, they've all made their way to the big person's table of economic development. And that has been an evolving process. I've done smart growth for almost 25 years now, and people scoffed at me when I said that it was the new wave, it was what was going to attract people to our upstate communities. Downtown revitalization, community revitalization, green and sustainability, and that has proven true. But it's still a fuzzy concept, community, regional development. It's a complex concept. It's not a construct that fits into any one department. I sit at the Department of State because we house the state planning office, but the way I approach smart growth is not to set up an empire of smart growth that people have to come to for direction. It is more for me to go out to, say, the Energy Research Authority and convince them that smart growth and community development are part and parcel to energy and climate policy. It's up to me to go out to the Department of Transportation and convince them that their infrastructure investments can have either positive or negative community and resiliency and sustainability outcomes. And I think in many ways that's the way we're going to have to handle resiliency. We're moving from sustainability and smart growth into this area that is even more complex and fuzzy and amorphous than smart growth and sustainable development. And we're going to have to adapt. I mean, our constructs, our bureaucratic constructs in particular, which I can focus on because I'm part of a bureaucracy, need to adapt. They need to evolve in order to address resiliency, just as they needed to evolve to address community and regional development. I feel like I got a master's degree a couple of years ago in community development and resiliency when Governor Cuomo held 10 regional sustainable development and collaborative governance conferences, one in each of his regional economic development councils. We all in Albany, as hard as we try, as much as we get out into communities and speak at forums like this, we have to confront the fact that we do exist in an ivory tower. And we must continue to connect with what's happening on the ground and adapt. So it was such a learning experience for me to go out and plan these conferences. It was a very interesting concept that the governor handed down. He said, look, here's the only structure I'm going to give you. Here are the components of community development: housing, economic development, infrastructure, and environment/equity. Within that, mix and match. Find out what partnerships are out there and what partnerships can be forged. Because, as I mentioned, community development is a fuzzy, complex concept. It defies definition. And at one of the conferences in Buffalo, the governor said this, if you don't mind me quoting him, because I think it's a good backdrop for resiliency policy. Defining community is not easy. Defining community development is not easy. It's not easy because community is an art form. Community is a feeling. Community is a spirit. Community is a mutuality. It's a bond among people, and you have to take those neighborhoods, individual neighborhoods that is, and forge community and knit a strategy together that works for that particular community and that is personal to that community. Now, it makes a whole lot of sense until you go back to Albany and try to develop policy around concepts like community is a feeling, community is a soul, community is a spirit, which is why people laugh at me when I try to. But it really sparked a greater understanding of what we have to get to with community development. And it also laid the groundwork for my understanding of resiliency and how that fits into community development and smart growth. I'll get to that a little bit later. I think that those two concepts, three concepts, should be married and joined. They are on the street, on the community level. We should do that on the state level. But I bring up community development because I think it gets us to what we're confronting with, I already made a mess up here, with resiliency. What is resiliency? It's almost the first question I get. Everybody wants a definition. I used to get this with smart growth, too. So I asked myself and you, do we even need a definition of resiliency? We pretty much know that it's developing systems that are robust, that can resist shocks and bounce back as quickly as possible to its previous state, and better yet, bounce forward into a heightened state, a more enlightened state that is more prepared for the next inevitable shock. Shocks which we see with greater frequency and severity, of course, in New York, especially upstate. So that's the general definition, and I don't think we need to spend too much more time with it because it all depends, just like smart growth, on what resiliency means to each individual community. Just making sure that works. And each region of the state. It must be an adaptable concept. It must be a loose, even amorphous concept because it must be applied to different situations, different state agencies, different disciplines, and different regions of the state. It really is, in many respects, part and parcel to systems thinking, which is itself an amorphous concept. Thinking in systems and then acting, in my case, in government, through the lens of systems. Because communities are systems, they're complex systems, and establishing resiliency within them is about the most complex governance strategy or policy area that you can possibly think of. So before we get caught up, I think in Albany, in exercises and definitions and strategic plans and programs and policies, I think we need to stop and say, okay, we're confronting a policy area that is far more complex than any others, and we don't have the proper systems in place to address them. I'll be frank with you, the conventional systems that we've developed in state and local government are just catching up, barely, to the concept of resiliency. We'll always be catching up because they're bureaucratic constructs that were developed to address relatively simple, non-complex issues. And we're now into this area of complexity we call resiliency. So I have to ask just a few questions before we get going here. Are our systems evolving? Pretty good question. Because we have to. We're dead if we don't. Are we learning and applying what we've learned? In other words, are we developing feedback loops that inform us constantly on what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong? And then are we adapting and evolving to those realities? Are we taking risks? Are we challenging ourselves to possibly fail in addressing resiliency in order to succeed in the long run? And maybe if we want to get even a little bit more fuzzy here, I figure I can get a little fuzzy and touchy-feely. I'm in Ithaca, right? Sorry. Are we transforming in the process? Are we transforming ourselves in the process of addressing community resiliency? And are we transforming and adapting our systems in response to resiliency? Does that seem abstract? Well, I think it's very real, and I think it's very pragmatic. The systems that we've allowed to prevail and continue through sheer routine, rote, comfort, and past practice, to me, are the abstractions. The reality is government has to adapt, and I know that we can. I work for a governor who, since his days as HUD secretary, has constantly tried to turn bureaucratic systems and governmental systems on their heads to respond to changing conditions. I'll give you one very concrete example. When he came into office, he saw that the top-down, Albany-based approach to economic development hadn't worked. So he said, what the heck? Let's try something new here. How about each region is its own economy? with its own personalities and relationships and communities. Let's turn economic development spending and policy over to them. So he did it. Could have fallen flat on its face, but it didn't. I view these regional councils as democracy at your doorstep, one of those governance reforms that I think can get to what is happening in the community and bring that up to what we do in formulating policy and programs in Albany. He created a system, a local ecosystem, that I think we can learn from. He went one step further in developing, in changing economic development policy by formulating regional sustainability plans and regional sustainability consortiums, and didn't just put them in separate buckets, recognizing that we have no environment, no economy without a sustainable environment. He made the regional councils, economic development people, business people, sit down with the sustainability characters and fuse sustainability, equity, environmental sustainability with economic development policy. I think those are the sort of risks we need to take when it comes to resiliency. So how do we get there? I mentioned that we did these conferences, and we didn't just call them sustainable development conferences, we called them sustainable development and collaborative governance. And the message there is you can't have one without the other. Sustainability, resiliency, it's all about the partnerships. And when we did these conferences, we heard that refrain over and over again. It's partnerships, it's collaboration, it's breaking down bureaucratic walls, disciplinary walls. It's something you do quite well here at Cornell, by the way, through your Atkinson Center for Sustainability. A few years ago, you produced a report that brought together, I think, 10 or 12, David, how many departments, how many disciplines, with a very cogent and practical approach to interdisciplinary sustainability. A miracle that many academics could sit down together and agree on this set of principles that were not fluff. Major step in the right direction. I was inspired by that. By the way, it's not a shot at academics. I'm a lawyer. We would still be talking about that report 8 years later now. If it were on our plate. So congratulations to the Atkinson Center. I think you're moving us forward. I shared that report, and many other people in Albany were impressed. But collaborative governance is the key here. Elaine Kmark from the Brookings Institute used to head up Al Gore's Reinventing Government initiative. Some of you may remember that in the 90s, where they just broke down a lot of bureaucratic red tape, collaborated across agency lines. And her conclusion was that the modern government of the 20th century was built problem by problem, agency by agency. But as government matured and it became clear that some of the most difficult problems defied jurisdictional boundaries and were resistant to bureaucratic routines, as a result, in recent years, scholars have noted that governance is replacing government as the modus operandi of democratic societies. So there's been a shift, I think, in the Cuomo administration right from the beginning towards collaborative governance, talking about governance. And what does that mean? I think it's a big paradigm shift for us that we need to understand. It means that government is not in the driver's seat all the time. We can't solve all of your problems. We don't know how to, number one, in many cases, and we don't have the resources anymore to do that. So government can play whatever role it plays to help the process, help achieve the goal and the solution. We can be the convener. We can be the funder. We can be the facilitator. We can, in some cases, just get out of the way and remove obstacles that we've put up to resiliency and community development. So that's the idea of governance that Elaine Kmark is trying to get to, and what I think the governor is also getting to, and what we need to get to in addressing resiliency policy. But it's hard because we got to think differently in state government. We have to think holistically. We have to think integratively, collaboratively. All concepts that are, in many cases, not built into conventional bureaucratic and government systems. And as hard as we try, there's a pull in government always to go back to what's familiar and what's safe. Reminds me of the famous quote in The Godfather 3. Pardon me, I almost always quote the first two, because the third one was so bad. But you remember that one scene where he's trying to go legit and he just keeps saying, they keep pulling me back in. That's what it feels like in Albany. But we have to resist that because we have no other choice. So how do we get there? I think it's all about linkages and networks. The great network theorist, Albert Laszlo Barabasi, and I don't even know if I ever pronounced his name correctly, said that networks are everywhere. You just have to recognize them and act on them. And I think they're true. I think that that's true. Linkages and networks are what are going to get us to collaborative governance, which is going to get us to solutions to resiliency, which touches on almost every agency and policy area in Albany. The world operates like this, in links and hubs and nodes and networks, right? We know that. We know that in our social lives more than anywhere else. We have the hubs, we have the people that we go to more frequently than others. We have the dispensers of information, the networks, the clusters of social activity. We have the same thing in government. It even gets as complex as this. This is a standard social network analysis that just shows how complex our relationships are. And I always ask myself, why do we end up here? Right? That makes no sense whatsoever. It's not the way the world works. The world works in circles, diagonals, horizontal lines, sometimes vertical. I try to avoid that part of it as much as possible. But this is the way the world works in government, and this is the way it works in real life. So how do we get to this in government? Well, I'll give you one example that applies directly to Tompkins County. Oops. Not yet, Paul. One of the linkages that I made after Superstorm Sandy was between smart growth / land use and resiliency. It just made sense to me and a little cadre of conspirators that if you're doing smart growth, if you're doing your land use policies, if you're making infrastructure and development decisions, you should be thinking about building resiliency and robustness into those processes. It's the perfect open door. But conversely, what I learned was that when you're planning for resiliency, you should also be thinking about your land use outcomes. Where we build, it's as simple as this. Where do we build? Where do we not build? And where we do build, how do we do it? That's the perfect platform for building resiliency into communities and regions. So we formed this little shadow network called simply the Smart Growth Resiliency Partnership, and it was based on an agreement between the EPA and FEMA. Believe it or not, they signed an agreement, legal contractual agreement, that said when you do resiliency, FEMA, you must consult with EPA Smart Growth. And when you, EPA, do Smart Growth, you have to consult with FEMA. And they actually gave them some money. Now, it sounds funny that you have to sign an agreement to do interagency collaboration. It was weird to me at first, but the stark reality, which I got from the people I was dealing with, was you get your head cut off unless you have an agreement. You get your head cut off trying to cross agency and bureaucratic and programmatic lines in the federal government. Unfortunately, that's not the case in agency. In state government now, it's moving in the other direction. But that agreement just said to me that that's a key linkage, and we must look for those linkages everywhere. As I mentioned earlier, I have a role in state energy and climate policy, but I'm the Smart Growth Director. Why? Well, the way we plan and develop our communities has a tremendous impact on energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So it's my job to go out to the energy folks and say, yo, man, let me crash on your couch. I'm not an energy guy, but I do know that smart growth has an impact on what you do. And so they let me crash on the couch. It's those linkages in state government that I think are going to get us to a sound resiliency policy. And here's the key. If there's one takeaway that has just banged me over the head for years, and it's one that really hit me when I heard Arash speak at a climate resiliency conference, it's not just the idea of public engagement. We all do public engagement in government. Sometimes it's boilerplate, sometimes it's creative, and sometimes it's extremely effective, but it tends towards the boilerplate. We go back to the familiar, invite everyone to a room and put little colored dots on the wall and register how many comments you've gotten. But it's all based on getting people to come to us. What I'm getting here, partially sparked by listening to Arash last year, is that there's another level of public engagement that I call engaged engagement. And it's going out to people where they live and play and work and act and think and eat and drink, and getting them in their setting, in the most comfortable setting possible, so it's as little like government outreach as possible. Call it engaged engagement. Now, what does that have to do with resiliency? For me, everything. Resiliency, if we're going to start addressing it in systems thinking, must be a series of feedback loops. And what's the most important feedback loop? Is not Paul Beyer, banging away at other agencies, convincing them that smart growth is a good thing. It's the people in the communities that we're developing programs for. In fact, one of my colleagues, I made that statement to one of my colleagues recently in the private sector, and she said, well, think of it this way, Paul. If you're not developing programs and policies for people, you should be thinking that you're developing programs and policies with people. And once you shift that framework, you're going to go out to the community and engage in what we call engaged engagement. So here are a couple of examples of how I think we can feed into resiliency policy. By the way, I'm not going to get into science and technical stuff with my talk. This is like process and governance, but I don't think we get to the science and the solutions without governance reforms. So anyway, I stumble upon this amazing program in Western New York, launched by the Ralph C. Wilson Foundation. How many people know who Ralph C. Wilson is? What? He was the longtime owner of the Buffalo Bills. Is this not Bills country? What is it? Don't tell me this is Patriots country, is it? Yeah, and let's not get into baseball today, okay? So anyway, Ralph C. Wilson passed away, longtime owner. He set up an endowment, a foundation, and one of the priority areas is caregiving. And what the foundation was finding is that they really weren't getting deep into what caregiving means for the caregiver. Pretty good, important question. If you're developing programs for the people who are cared for, you should also care about the caregiver and know what they're experiencing. So here's what they did. They hired a group of anthropologists to go out into the community, into the homes, into the parks that they go to, the places they eat. They asked them to keep diaries and journals of what they experience day to day. These are people who are caring for family members or friends. They had to get that deep into what it meant to be a caregiver, to develop a program with them and not just for them. So I offer hope. Are there any anthropology majors or professors in the audience here? Okay, for those anthropology majors who are walking around campus wondering what the heck they're going to do with their degree, there is a whole firm called the Practica Group, I don't mind giving them a plug, who only hires anthropologists. And apparently this is a trend now, because they have that notion in their mind that they have to get inside the culture and the setting, but they also have to have that outsider's perspective to comment and develop program and policy. So they used anthropologists. I don't know, is it just me? That's just incredible. I've never heard that. Usually you hire outreach people or tech firms or engineering firms who make believe they can do engagement. How else can we do this? A couple of examples that I came across during, after Sandy, Superstorm Sandy. I did a lot of outreach on Long Island. There's one that I have no better acronym for this than POO. P-O-O. One of my colleagues told me, Paul, please do not say poo at a keynote speech in Cornell. But it stands for pub-oriented outreach. And believe it or not, one of these anthropologists I spoke to said, yes, Paul, we went to the bars and talked to people. And I remembered in Babylon, New York, after Superstorm Sandy, after a big public meeting, engagement event, we retreated to the American Legion post where they served only Bud and Bud Light. Yes, the American Legion post in Babylon does not have flower power or anything near it. So I suffered, but from 3 dudes at the bar, I probably got more than the 250 people that showed up at the outreach event. Getting to where people make their decisions, live their lives, let down, and be themselves. The other one, and then I'll stop, is FOO, F-O-O, food-oriented outreach. And for this, I'm not an expert, but I will draw on the genius of Anthony Bourdain. It occurred to me, after watching his programs about food, that it wasn't about food at all. He had this way of starting with food and slowly getting to like people's souls, like their culture, their context, their family, like really personal stuff. And learning about who they are and what their context is. That's the type of public engagement we need to do if we're going to really understand what resiliency means on the ground. We don't get a lot of flooding in Albany. And if we do, I'm in a big old building that's never going to flood or be affected. But I learned that people deal with flooding on an almost weekly and monthly basis. It wasn't just Superstorm Sandy on Long Island. So many people told me, Paul, at high tide, during a moderate rain, we get flooding. And we smell it. It's that type of flooding. The water table is rising. We live with it. You in upstate deal with riverine flooding and the risk of blockages during a storm and overflows that are entirely unpredictable. So that's how we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of, let's just call it community resiliency, because it really is local and personal. And because it's so unpredictable and because it's such a fuzzy concept, I would say embrace mistakes, embrace failures, embrace uncertainty and unpredictability. You can't manage a complex and unpredictable concept like climate change and climate resiliency unless your systems are also resilient, unless they are resilient to shocks and failures and mistakes and disturbances. Brad Statz, in his book Never Stop Learning, said that mistakes aren't a necessary evil. They aren't an evil at all. They're an inevitable consequence of doing something new, and as such should be seen as valuable. Without them, we'd have no originality. Easy to quote, hard to apply. And I'm going to reflect for one moment, if you don't mind me going just a little bit over time, on a couple of my favorite musicians, Herbie Hancock and Miles Davis. Herbie Hancock tells a story when he was a young man. I think he was only 17, playing with the Miles Davis Quintet. Can you imagine that? 17 playing with Miles. They were jamming at the Village Vanguard one night, and they were on. And Herbie said this was one of his best nights, and he's improvising over a jazz standard. And in the middle of it, he just got carried away and hit the wrong chord and went in the wrong direction, and everyone in the band winced, except Miles. Miles looked over at him and shifted the song, changed the key, changed the very tenor of the song, mid-song, to accommodate Herbie's mistake, and went off in a totally different direction. If that ever happened in a bureaucracy, they would have sat Herbie down and said, my man, no more improvising for you. Stick to the chart, stick to the song, here's what we're playing, and don't take any more risks. But fortunately, Miles went up to him afterward and gave him a pat on the back and said, that's great, man, we're going to use that again. Miles had that voice that I can't do. We're going to do that next time, Herbie, don't worry about it. I think we need more of that. So I say get lost, not in its pejorative sense, but don't mind getting lost, because it's probably where we're going to get found. I already made this point, never stop learning. What we're developing in Albany now on a number of levels, different policies are learning collaboratives, so we don't just give grants to communities, we require them to teach and to learn from one another as they go through the grant application process. Why? Because grants, especially in the community development area, should never be ends in themselves. They should be exponential. They should grow and expand. And we should all be learning from one another. We should treat natural disasters as opportunities. There are so many examples that I have listed here. I don't have time to go through where tragedy has led to sustainability and resiliency. You may have all heard the story of Greensburg, Kansas, literally wiped off the map in a tornado in 2007. 90% of the building stock destroyed. Half the population just split. The other half stayed in a tent and said, you know what, we're going to do it right. We're not going to sprawl, we're going to be green, and we are going to be a nationwide destination for sustainability and green living. And now they are. There is a Resilient New York initiative in New York State. I think we're addressing resiliency on many different fronts, and some of the panelists here are going to talk about specific policies and programs, so I won't go into that. But I am going to end, believe me. I'm only a couple of minutes over time. I don't know about that, but I'm going to end with something of an ode to the millennials. I talk to millennials, the new crop of employees in state government, about these funny things like networks and the importance of having diversity at the table in developing programs, problem solving, collaboration, flat, not hierarchical decision-making systems. And you know the funny thing about it? Like, they get it instinctually. I don't know why they get a bad rap. I mean, they're like being tagged as you know, caring more about themselves than their work, selfish. Don't blame them if the world that we're leaving to them. But for some reason, they get networks. They operate in networks. And what I'm talking about here is just natural to them. So I give this little ode to millennials as a form of outreach. Listen to these folks, the younger folks. They have a lot to add to the governance side of policymaking and programmatic operations. We could learn a lot from them in their network thinking and their view and their worldview when it comes to, particularly to sustainability, the economy, and resiliency. And finally, back to my friend Albert Laszlo Barabasi, or Laszlo. Keep in mind that imagination is at the heart of all innovation. Crush or constrain it, and the fun will vanish. So I would just say that I'm proud to be part of an administration in Albany that breaks down walls and conventions and doesn't crush or constrain imagination and innovation, but rather creates systems that allow for it. And without that, we're never going to get to solving the problem of resiliency. Thank you so much.